The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Whenever we are thinking about the method section, I want you to think about what exactly went into in order to conduct the study, any study, whether it be computer science, engineering, mental health, whatever type of study. What you're going to find in the method section is basically a description, if you will. What was the procedure? Who did we talk to? What did we sample? Who didn't we sample? What ethical considerations did we have in regards to our study? What are some of the statistical procedures that we conducted in order to understand our study? So whenever you're thinking about the method section, remember that methods means what went into play in order for this research study to be conducted. For instance, if it was an engineering study, what type of metal, what type of chemicals went into, say, for example, testing the corrosion of that piece of metal or that piece of construction equipment, for example, if you're in civil engineering. So notice that the method section is going to include, okay, what exactly happened and how did we go about conducting our study? So let's look into the specifics as to a method section. Notice that, let me give you an example. Say, for instance, if I was going to survey students in our university, notice that generally in a class of this nature, generally N, right? N always represents the subjects or the participants. So for example, the average amount of students in an introduction class is 97, and I teach 3 introduction classes, and I teach 2 advanced classes. So in an introductory class, if I were to conduct a research, notice that this is what the method would look like. So for example, my participants would hover around 97. And also within a method section, I need to describe to you the demographics of said study. So for example, generally the average age here is 20, which I hate to admit because I'm not 20 years old anymore, but I love you guys all the same. So generally, the vast majority of students in an introductory class tend to identify his or herself as white. Now, for introductory classes, the vast majority of psychology or students that are in an introductory course tend to identify as women. That didn't used to be the case back when psychology started. The vast majority of students were male, and that has actually shifted. Now, depending on the field, some fields are more female dominated in psychology, but then there are other fields in psychology that are more male dominated. So it depends on the field now. What is another characteristic that you will find in a method? Well, for your study, right, remember that I need you to describe the design, okay? I need you to describe the design. What exactly do we refer to? What are we talking about when we are talking about a design? A design is what did the study look like, right? What did the study look like? So for example, think about how many independent variables did we have? How many dependent variables did we have? What is the interaction or the effects that we expect to see from these specific variables? So notice that the design, you're telling me exactly what is the expectation of what it will look like. So if I were to give you an analogous example, think about the hypothetical example that I just gave you about introductory students in a class for psychology. So think about here, most of you are not in psychology. Most of you are either in engineering or computer science, the vast majority of you. So I can expect, for example, the independent variable of lecture. right? Perhaps would be more interesting to those of you who are in health sciences or social sciences than it would be, say, for example, for a student in engineering or computer science, which I hope is not the case, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed the class so far. But notice that that would be part of my design, because now I am explaining the impact of an independent variable upon the demographic characteristic of, say, for example, the faculty that you belong to. So that would be an example of a design. Something immensely important that goes into that method section whenever you are writing your own is we need to explain whether or not the participants were mixed. For example, the control participants and the experimental participants, I should say. Notice that if we revert to your slide, let's look at to the description of the Huffcut paper. Notice that in regards to Huffcut, the design was multifactorial. And who can tell me what multifactorial means? Yes, ma'am.
Something that has multiple variables or like subjects that affect.
Fantastic. You get a fantastic today. So that is absolutely correct. What does that mean? It means that there were multiple factors, that there were multiple variables in play in order to conduct a study. Notice that here we have a 2x3 design. Notice that we have the 2 variables, the 2 independent with the 3 dependent variables. So it wasn't simply just one independent variable having an effect of the dependent. Notice that we have 2 variables that are going to be impacting 3 variables. Notice that another characteristic that we want to look into is whether or not we utilize the same subjects, separate subjects, or would they mix the subjects. Notice that here they utilize both approaches, meaning that it is a mixed subject design. Let's look into the specifics of the dependent variables. In regards to the dependent variables, we had the coworker rating. On the coworker rating, in regards to the Huffcut article, if you remember from reading the article, you had a 1 through 7, right? 1 through 7 in regards to the coworker rating. And then you had a 1 through 7 in regards to the attractiveness. We also had other forms of data, and here we have the frequency data. For instance, how many people are we going to hire in regards to the negative notes? And if you recall from our previous slide, you remember that in regards to that, the higher, right? The higher that negative interview, the higher that frequency that that individual was not going to be hired. That is another example of the variables that you can find in regards to frequency data. And we also talked about correlational data, right? The relationship between one variable and the other. So in this specific case, we had positive coworker rating, or rating, I should say, and in regards to your salary. So the more positive, for example, that coworker rating, the more likely you are going to receive a more substantial salary later on. Let's talk a little bit more about the independent variables, right? And we're still within that methods section, okay? We're in that methods section. Unless there are any questions. Good deal. Let's talk about the independent variables. Who can tell me what an independent variable is in general terms, in any field? What does it mean to have an independent variable? Correct. So in regards to an independent variable, Dr. Nunez over here, she's one of my former victims from one of my other, students from my other class. So in regards to an independent variable, I am able to control it. I'm able to manipulate it. So for instance, in regards to therapy, say for example, the amount of medication, right, that I am giving to a potential research participant. And if we revert back to the Huffcut article, you'll notice that one of the independent variables was that of the physical attractiveness, right? The physical attractiveness of that individual, the face of that individual, how attractive that person was. So for example, a low attractive face, a high attractive face. Notice that in regards to this face, the face was computer generated, right? The face was computer generated in regards to what would be a low attractive face and what would be a high attractive face. Now, another independent variable, and if you recall, if we go back to our design, notice that I mentioned we had two, right? This is a 2x3 multifactorial, meaning that we have more than one independent variable and more than one dependent. So let's look at our second independent variable. And that is our interview notes. Notice that the interview notes, we can also manipulate, right? Therefore, they're considered an independent variable. And here we have either positive, neutral, or negative interview notes. So notice that that is also another independent variable. Let's look at the dependent variables. As I noted earlier, remember, if we go back to our previous slide, notice that I mentioned it was multifactorial, meaning that we have two independent, which was the face attractiveness and the notes, and then we have three dependent variables. Notice that these three dependent variables will depend upon the control and manipulation of that independent. So let's look at our three variables. Let's look at our three dependent variables. In regards to a dependent variable, who can tell me what a dependent variable is? Yes, sir. Measured. That is correct. Something that is being measured. Something that is being impacted upon. So for instance, I have my independent variable of high physical, or I should say high attractiveness of that face, and its impact, say for example, on my dependent variables. How are we going to measure those dependent variables? So in regards to Huffcut, let's look at the specific dependent variables. The first one is trait ratings. That was the first dependent variable. And like I said, we're going to have three. That first one is the trait ratings. So think about in regards to physical attractiveness and the person being physically unattractive. And we're going to rate this person in regards to a Likert scale. Some people call it Likert, some people call it Likert. And I think that's one of the biggest debates that we have in our field because no one can come into an agreement as to how exactly to pronounce it. So in regards to the Likert scale, we will rate the individual as a 1 for physically attractiveness to being unattractive. Notice that another characteristic of this trait rating is that the persons had to list and take into account whenever the trait rating is considered, whether or not they would avoid that person as a coworker or that they would want that person as a coworker based on their physical attractiveness. Let's look at our second dependent variable because recall we got 3. It is a multifactorial design. So let's look at our second dependent variable. We are thinking about is determining the salary, the starting salary of that person. Notice that in this specific case, we're going to talk about whether this person was hired or not. And our last variable is going to be that of the range of the salary. Here we have 20,000 all the way up to 50,000 a year. Any questions specifically concerning the method section, whether it be with the independent or dependent variables? Any questions about that? Let's look into another characteristic of the method section, and that is, remember that the method section tells me what did you do? What was the process? What did you utilize? And of course, one of the components of that method sections that you're going to write about is that of materials. In regards to materials, what did we utilize? Well, the first thing that we utilized was the computer-generated faces. Notice that we had, for example, one average face, and that was the practice trial in regards to determine what would be considered average. And then we also had 3 low attractive faces with men and 3 low attractive faces with women. And that was the first survey that they conducted in order to determine which ones would be considered low attractive. Now, they conducted a second survey to ascertain which 3 faces would be considered high attractive faces for men and 3 high attractive faces for women. What else did they utilize? What other materials did they utilize? Well, they used the interview notes, of course. Notice that with the interview notes, they did the same thing. They utilized a practice trial to determine which one would be considered neutral, either favorable or unfavorable in regards to the job applicant. Now, they also, based on that trial, now we're going to have 4 neutral, 4 positive, and 4 negative notes in regards to the interview notes. Notice that the notes would contain 9 statements. 9 statements. We also utilize a third material, and that is of Masons. Notice that here we had a distractor task in regards to the person focusing, in regards to the rating of the attractiveness or the ratings for coworker ratings. Notice that here they would have a maze as a distractor task. The next thing that you would include in a method section is the procedure. How exactly did you do what you said you did? That is what the procedures section in a method section means. What did you do? Exactly. And you want to be as detailed as possible. Because with said details, we eliminate, for example, the potential for bias. We eliminate the potential, say, for example, that you're fabricating your results. Or if I had to replicate your study and see whether or not I come up with the same results, this is another reason why the method section has to be very detailed. Notice that their procedure, we're going to split in 3 parts, right? What was the process? What did they do? Notice that here they would have the face plus the notes, right? Remember that we had a total of 9 notes. Then they moved into the process of rating. And the last section was a distractor maze, right? So those were the 3 steps, if you will, in regards to their process. Notice that, as I mentioned, they also had a trial sequence. Notice that here they would present 30 seconds of that stimulus. So for example, the face with the notes, then 30 seconds with the ratings in regards to their attractiveness, coworker ratings, and then their salary. And then the 10 seconds of that distractor maze. So that goes specifically in regards to that specific trial. Let's look into the practice trial. Specifically in regards to the practice trial, we're going to present the individuals with an average face and neutral notes. So if you recall from our previous slide, remember that we were going to show them with an average face in their practice trial and a neutral note in their practice trial. Now, in regards to the actual experiment, they conducted 6 trials and they were randomized, meaning that in regards to the notes, they could have either received a positive, a negative, or neutral note. It was at random. This is an example of the faces, right? This is an example of what the faces, they were computer generated. Notice that here we have an illustration of that distractor maze. Notice that we have 6 listed here. Notice that they were presented after the individual had to provide a rating. Notice that here on your left, you have the stimulus of an average male. And also here, we are looking at the actual experimental trial, the one that was randomized. So notice that here we have a female who was considered in regards to the high physical attractiveness. Here we have a second female who was also considered to be in the high physical attractiveness. Then a third female for the high physical attractiveness. If you look at the bottom of your screen, the bottom left, notice that here we have female number 1 as computer generated for low physical attractiveness, second female for low physical attractiveness, and then a third female. Notice that each stimulus, right, the physical attractiveness, was accompanied by an interview note. So for example, we have at random, if the interview was neutral, positive, or negative, paired with an unattractive female. Here we have, or an attractive female, I should say, and then here we have a low attractive female that's computer generated. And then we have the interview notes for that female. So this is what the experiment would have looked like for the research participants. Here we are looking into the statistics. Notice that here we have 2, and here we have a 2x3 mixed ANOVA. ANOVA stands for analysis of variance. And for those of you who are going to take research classes, statistics classes, you're going to actually be conducting ANOVAs yourself. So let's look at the specifics in regards to this 2x3 mixed ANOVA. Notice that we're going to look at the main effect of face and the main effect of notes. Then we're also going to test for face plus the notes interaction. So remember that interaction is whenever we are mixing the 2 factors, whenever we are missing the 2 factors. Notice that again, we're going to have the dependent variable of coworker rating plus the dependent variable of attractive rating. Then we are going to be followed along by a dependent t-test. After we conducted our analysis of variance, we conducted a dependent t-test. And in this specific case, we have a comparison on the coworker rating. And this comparison was based on negative to positive rating or negative to neutral rating. Now, let's look into the last characteristic of these statistics within your methods. Notice that one of the last things that you would mention within your method section is the frequency data. And as I noted earlier, I should say, in regards to frequency data, remember frequency is amount of, right? It describes the amount of. So for instance, in regards to the specific study, you would have the frequency of hiring based on a negative notes. If I have a negative note, would that increase the chances or decrease the chances of me hiring someone? And what's going to happen here is that we're going to analyze the goodness of fit of a chi-square. And whenever we start talking about our statistics come next class, I'm going to describe to you exactly what does that look like. Most of you know, remember, that we have correlations. Correlations simply mean relationships. So here we're going to determine whether or not there is a relationship between positive notes of the coworker rated. Does it relate to the starting salary for all notes? So for instance, positive coworker rating to positive salary, positive coworker rating to neutral salary, positive coworker rating to negative salary. And then we're going to analyze Pearson correlation coefficients. And we will talk in detail as to what a Pearson correlation coefficient is. Meaning that there are certain statistics Based on the cutoff score, we can determine if something has a no relationship whatsoever, a low relationship, moderate, or high relationship. We're going to talk about that very in detail in our upcoming lectures.